This PowerPoint is on the second part of chapter 1, where we'll look at the subdisciplines of psychology. In other words, different types of psychology. There are many different types, and we'll take a look at a few. It doesn't nearly cover all the types that there are, but I think these are some of the most popular ones. First, we'll look at biopsychology, which, as you might be able to guess from the name, explores how our biology influences our behavior. We know that a huge part of psychology is the interaction between our behavior and our thoughts and our feelings. Well, biopsychology explores how does your biology influence that. It may focus on sensory motor symptoms, sleep, drug use and abuse, ingestive behavior, reproductive behavior, neurodevelopment or the development of the brain, the plasticity of the nervous system, and any other biological correlates of psychological disorders. So we know, for example, that if we don't get enough sleep, that's going to influence the way we think. We may not think as well, and it's going to influence our behavior. We know if we use drugs, that definitely influences the way we think and the way we feel, therefore our behavior. So a biopsychologist is going to look at how biology influences our behavior and also our emotions and thoughts. They do often work with other disciplines. As you can imagine, a biopsychologist might work with a sleep expert. They might work with someone who's trained in drug use and abuse treatment. They might work with an OBGYN on reproductive behavior. So it's often a multidisciplinary task. Another type of psychology is called evolutionary psychology, which is essentially the study of a behavior is impacted by genetics. We discussed Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection in a previous PowerPoint, but let's look at it again. It is essentially the theory that organisms well fitted to their environments, well adapted to their environments, will have offspring and pass on useful adaptations to future generations, while those with harmful traits will die off. So as we discussed in a previous PowerPoint, essentially those people, those organisms who are helpfully and really adapted to their environment, we know they're going to be more likely to survive, they're going to be more likely to live longer, they're going to be more likely to pass on their genes and reproduce, and so they will be passing on their genes. Those who aren't adapted to their environment are probably going to die off, and therefore they're not going to be able to pass on their genes. The approach taken by most evolutionary psychologists is to predict the outcome of a behavior in a particular situation based on evolutionary theory, and then to make observations or conduct experiments to determine whether the results match the theory. So essentially, they look at an organism's behavior in a certain situation. They say, let me predict what that's going to mean for the future behavior. And then they observe the situation. They do experiments, which we'll learn more about the dynamics of experiments later, to see if what they observed and what they guessed is what really turns out. A weakness of this approach is the assumption that a behavior is biological as opposed to cultural. We know that all of our behaviors are not due to genetics. There's also a cultural environmental component. They're influenced by our family, the environment we grow up in, the community we grow up in, the culture we have. So we can't assume that everything is just genetics. Cognitive psychology focuses on studying cognitions or thoughts and their relationship to our experiences and our actions. So it really goes back to the connection between our thoughts and our feelings and our behavior. Cognitive psychology specifically studies how our thoughts affect our actions and our relationships. Just the little diagram on the right, part of cognition is the way we perceive things. It's the way we judge situations. It's the way we reason things out. It's how we learn. It's how we evaluate situations, and it involves our memory. How do we remember things? And we'll look more at all of those things later in the class. Developmental psychology is a scientific study, as you might have guessed, of development across a lifespan. You can see from the diagram it goes from aspects of being a baby to being an elderly person. And it focuses on the differences in physical, cognitive, and social capacities that exist between very young children and adults. In other words, what's the difference between how a toddler thinks and how a middle-aged person thinks? It looks at those different aspects of between in the lifespan. Personality psychology involves identifying and measuring personality traits. Personality is the set of unique and relatively stable patterns of thought, emotion, and behavior. Here we go back to that connection between the way we think and the way we feel and the way we behave. So it's the thought, emotion, and behavior that define an individual and their distinctive way of experiencing and interacting with the world. Personality traits are thought to be rooted in genetic and environmental factors, and they develop and evolve throughout an individual's lifespan. So here we go back to everything isn't just genetics. There's also an environmental factor, again, our culture, our family, the environment we grow up in. And our personality is essentially developed from a complicated combination of both those things. And also the last part of the quote, and they develop and evolve throughout an individual's lifespan, that's an indicator that our personality isn't static. The personality we have at age 9 doesn't necessarily mean we'll have the same personality at age 35. It's evolving, it grows depending on our experiments and situations we're involved in. So it's not static. Again, it's important to know that it grows throughout our lifetime. Social psychology, which later in the class you'll actually have a whole chapter on social psychology, is the study of your mind and behavior with other people. Those are the key words, with other people. This is how you interact within the context of other people. Looks at your personality, interpersonal relationships, and group behavior. How does being with another person, how does being in a group, how does that affect who you are, your personality? Focuses on differences in how we explain our own behavior versus how we explain the behaviors of others. Looks at prejudice, attraction, how we resolve interpersonal conflicts. Social psychologists have also sought to determine how being among other people changes our own behavior and patterns of thinking. So it's looking at not only how our own behavior affects our thinking and emotions, but how do other people's behavior and emotions and thoughts affect ours. It's kind of like an endless cycle that we affect theirs and they affect us. So social psychologists look at that, pretty much the individual in the context of a group. Industrial organizational psychology is also a chapter that will be devoted fully to it later on in the course. It's pretty interesting. I think it's rather new. It applies psychological principles and research methods to improve the overall work environment, including how employees perform, how they communicate with each other, how satisfied they are with the job, and how safe they feel. As you can see in the diagram above, it includes a lot more than that. It includes analyzing the job, what the aspects of the job are, how to recruit employees, how to appraise employees, how to evaluate their performance. It includes assuring that the quality of the employees and the company is acceptable. And it looks at just the overall culture of the organization. Health psychology explores the relationship between one's genetic makeup and patterns of behavior, relationships, and psychological stress, and your health. So again, we kind of see that combination of behavior and the social psychology aspect of how we live in relationships and our stress and our health, which is the biopsychology aspect of our health, how well our body's doing. And you can see from the diagram on the left that it includes a lot of different things. It includes our nutrition, the way we eat, our diet, how much sleep we get, what kind of health care we get. All these things are intertwined to be health psychology. Sport and exercise psychology, to me, is kind of related to health psychology. It studies the psychological aspects of sport performance, including motivation and performance anxiety, and the effects of sport on mental and emotional well-being. So how well do we perform at the sport? Is it anxiety that's causing us not to perform well? Is it that we have a lack of motivation to perform well? So they're really looking at the behavior of sports and exercise and how our thoughts and feelings are intertwined with that behavioral performance. Clinical psychology is probably the most popular form of psychology. It tends to be what we think of when we think of psychology because it looks at the diagnosis and treatment of psychological disorders and other problematic patterns of behavior. As you can see on the left, it essentially focuses on mental illness, which again, I think most people find that to be the most interesting part of psychology. Mental illness can include several different things. It could be an eating disorder, it can be schizophrenia, it can be anxiety, depression, bipolar, or it can be personality disorders. And we'll just discuss all of those later in the class also. You'll have a powerful chapter, related to mental illness types. And then also a chapter on how to treat those mental illnesses. The last type of psychology we'll look at is forensic psychology, which I think a lot of people also find this very interesting. It is the practice of applying psychology in the area of investigation, research, and observations related to criminal, civil, and family matters. So forensic psychologists may assess a person's competency to stand trial. They may assess the state of mind of a defendant. They may act as consultants on child custody cases or consult on sentencing and treatment recommendations. And they may advise on issues such as eyewitness testimony and children's testimony. So they can do a lot. For sure, working in the court system and working with people who are accused of committing a crime. So that's the last, again, type of psychology we look at. Again, there are several other types of psychology. Those are the main ones I can think of. But if you have questions about those types or any other types, please let me know.